I begin, I'd love to give you a little bit of context about myself and Anima and our journey, how we got here. So prior to starting Anima, I was a software engineer and then a Web3 researcher. And a core part of my research, I was at a British metaverse startup, was looking at extensibility and interoperability in EVM gaming. How can we record the data for on-game activity on the NFT itself? How can we have 3D objects that move between worlds? The answer is very, very difficult. Sort of end of 2022, the team were EVM maxis, but they were also Sui curious. And they put me on a Sui research project, and this was quite pivotal as I realized that these additional layers that we were actually building, all the functionality had native support on Sui. This was the beginning of my journey, and in 2024, I started with my co-founder Theo, who's here in the back. Towards the end of the year, we launched what was one of the first dynamic NFTs on the chain, and I am very pleased to say, after a little bit of delay, today we'll be launching our no-code launchpad. We have a bit of a plug. Puggy is going live today, 8 p.m. Dubai time, and we have a marketplace that we'll be following. But we're very interested in the future of marketplaces, and in particular, permissionless marketplaces. And equally, what do NFTs need to look like to make that feasible? What needs to happen with standards, with metadata, so that the front ends can be domain specific? They can actually build a high quality user experience, a high quality product. What does the next generation of Steam or the Unreal Store look like? What does the next generation of iTunes or Audible look like? And increasingly a question that I've been asking myself given the introduction of Seal and Walrus is, what does digital licensing look like on chain? If you go to 2003, we see the introduction of Steam and iTunes, and digital rights management, Apple's software Fairplay, was what catalyzed music and later video to come online. And Steam adopted a similar model. So what does that look like in the on-chain era? Now, before I go any further, I want to interrogate this question: are NFTs dead? This is actually the most asked question I receive, even from a Web3 crowd. In ETH Denver, when I said we're building in the NFT space, this is what I was asked. And I understand where this question comes from. We are very far from the heady highs of 2021 with Madonna and Justin Bieber buying apes. And some people do ask, and there is speculation, is the volume going to come back? But to me, it's an opportunity to elaborate what an NFT is, because I then realized that there is quite a significant chasm between how I perceive NFTs and potentially how others. NFTs are more than just Pepe the Frog, and whilst I love Pepe, I would like to see us add more than hyper-financialized frogs. So this begs the question, what is an NFT? And I'm sure majority of the room know, but nonetheless, we'd probably get a few different answers. So a small thought experiment, if you will. Let's look forward 10 years in time. A large chunk of economic activity has come on chain. We're seeing RWAs, property, even government services, and it's all running through public blockchains. You go to a general purpose permissionless marketplace, let's say a Web3 Amazon that just serves up digital assets, everything but tokens. What kind of items would you see on sale there? You could see a song, an album, a PFP, a game item, a passport, maybe a title deed. You might see a mortgage-backed security, a CDO. All of these are complex data that will have an individual ID. An NFT is any piece of user-owned data on-chain that has an individual ID. What is not is an asset class. And I think this is quite important because for us to really see actually Web3 as a whole thrive, we need to unbundle NFTs into their respective domains. When you have them as a single asset class, you end up in this position where everything is hyper-financialized and homogeneous, as opposed to the NFT itself being designed to cater towards this particular industry and a particular marketplace. So I think it's quite useful just to take a look where NFTs are relative to the rest of the media market. And today, compared to the top 3 forms of media, NFTs are about 10% of the market volume. It's perhaps not a direct comparison, given that NFTs is largely secondaries, and this actually speaks to the type of asset, whereas music, gaming, film is predominantly primary sales. But nonetheless, I think it gives some core insight. If you are, a lot of companies today, I think similar to the 1990s, where they were discussing what their internet strategy is, are discussing their NFT strategy. So Disney has an NFT strategy. You take Square Enix. Square Enix is pursuing trad gaming, but also Web3 gaming. Eli Roth recently had the Sui announcement, and there is going to be Web3 media distribution, but this is not at the expense of conventional media distribution. And so what we're seeing is, much like in the 1990s and early 2000s, where the internet was hyper-financialized, in C-suites around the world, they were saying, what is our television strategy? What is our radio strategy? What is our print strategy? What is our internet strategy? And this was fundamentally incorrect, because the internet was the substrate in which marketing and distribution took place. And we're now adding another layer, and this is the blockchain layer, with NFTs serving as the distribution mechanic. And I think this is applicable to industries across the board, but this requires differentiation with NFTs themselves. So given this perhaps lofty view of the future, or so I've been told, there's a core question of why is this applicable now? Given that NFTs came around in 2017, we've seen perhaps a bit of stasis, but we've seen billions of dollars of volume, iterations, attempts within different forms of media, royal. And fundamentally, this is because Sui unlocks a new NFT design space. Sui, but not just Sui, Walrus and other technologies such as Seal and even Slush, not Splash, not Stashed, and even Slush, they allow us to build in novel ways. As I'm sure most of the room know, the Sui is what they call a third generation blockchain, but this is actually true, with the first generation being UTXO and the second generation being an account-based chain. And these account-based chains, think accounting, whilst suitable for fungible items, actually have a problem with complex data. The ERC 721 standard for NFTs was actually an extension of the ERC 20 standard. And quite frankly, it shows. So what are the implications of this? So with the account model, this is actually a Solana-based NFT. And as you can see, the data is off-chain. And first and foremost, this is a fundamental issue. If a blockchain is supposed to be a global computing layer, it needs to be able to read the data of the files that it has. EVM and Solana-based chains cannot read the data that's actually on the chain. In fact, all of this data is stored off-chain. Now, what does this mean? If you take Ethereum, for example, 20% of NFTs on Ethereum actively do not exist because they use IPFS for the metadata and the media, and they have a centralized point of failure. Someone stopped paying for them. But what happens is the data is off-chain, and you end up with centralized layers like OpenSea who provide a caching service. So what we've seen is you have OpenSea, you have Magic Eden, you have these big monolithic players who provide centralized layers, and rather than blockchains creating one shared database, one shared substrate, we're actually adding more complexity because you still have the Web 2 stack. And in many respects, the Web 2 stack is extending the Web 3 stack because of inadequacies owing to low-level design decisions made before NFTs existed. Comparatively, if we take a look at Sui, on Sui, everything is an object. So a token, a sword, a game, a derivative, these are all on-chain objects, and all the metadata is stored on-chain. So we have reads. And reads are really important if you want to create complex permissionless apps, because if you want to create a domain-specific app, it needs to be able to pull data that is relevant to that given NFT. A music NFT or a gaming NFT are going to have data that's relevant for the marketplace, right? And that requires reads being possible. So we move into permissionless apps, but beyond that, they've introduced features such as dynamic fields. You get rights in some respect, not just reads and writes, but you can update the NFTs. And on top of that, NFTs can own other NFTs. So you can imagine a Pokemon that it wins in a battle, it gains experience points. This is reflected on chain. it levels up, it evolves, and it gets new moves. And these moves are modular objects. They are NFTs themselves that get switched out. You can imagine a house with a window and a front door made of thousands of on-chain bricks, an on-chain house. Each brick, each item is individually modifiable, tradable, removable. Sui really opens up this broad design space that wasn't possible previously. And it makes ushering in a next generation of on-chain media actually feasible. So something we've been exploring conceptually alongside Mirai is frameworks and standards. These are two concepts. So to kind of break this down, these are all domain specific. But to break this down, a framework would be this top level or base level object wrapper. So you may have, we threw a physical art event and we minted NFTs, and we realized all we'd actually done was create a commemorative token. So what does physical art actually need? Well, it needs a certificate of authenticity. It needs, every time you show in a gallery, that adds to the provenance. Owners add to the provenance. So you'd have this top level art object, which would be a framework, and then you have these standardized modules which relate to the needs of art. So this certificate of authenticity, show at an event, ownership, and all these are standardized. They can live in the Move registry. And the point is that standards are the foundation of composability, of interoperability. If you have multiple music platforms, which are permissionless, multiple art platforms, multiple gaming platforms, they need to be able to pass the data, and ideally in the same way. We want competition. Competition is healthy. It's the point of Web3 as opposed to gating. Now, this specific example is derived from work that Theo and myself has done. So you have this avatar framework, and in this case, imagine that there's an anima universe. We have an anima game, and we have templating for people to create objects that work in this universe. Perhaps there is a future whereby creators come, third parties, they mint items in this universe, you have network effects, and then just by virtue of the density and the fact that these worlds are, by virtue of the density of the items, people are deciding to use them, and you kind of get interoperability by default, even though these are differentiated worlds by different developers. So you would have, with these frameworks, you would have a series of prescriptive attributes, some static, and then you'd also have some dynamic ones. And again, all standardized. So these could be animations, they could be attacks, but something that we've been looking at is a 3D model standard. And anyone who's built games, there are markets for 3D models, for kit bashing, to move quickly. There's the Unreal Store, there's various others. But they have issues with standardization. So things like, if you want to have the optimal models, why don't we just use Draco compressed GLBs? It's the optimal standard for it. But beyond that, things like level of detail. Level of detail makes quite considerable difference. Different builds will work with different LODs. If you buy something on the Unreal Store, often the poly count is different. If you want to have people produce items that work in your games, your game will have certain requirements in terms of build, certain requirements in poly count. Equally, perhaps someone is building a first-person shooter and they're using this set of assets that can go between worlds that work in a broad variety of games. Well, for an FPS, you have a hitbox, which has certain dimensions. It has parameters. If the hitbox changes, it directly impacts the game. So any items that work for that world will actually have to have the scale. They need to have the dimensions on the item themselves. And from there, you're also moving into content moderation territory. Some worlds will not accept others. Perhaps you have a Disney-friendly world and a not safe for work world. Ultimately, anyone can build what they like, right? And the final piece there is things like licensing. If you go to the Unreal Store today, items are licensed. What does this look like? What are our goals with Web3? Do we want to move this development on-chain? And actually, what are the needs and desires of the developers who are creating the bulk of these items? They probably need to be listened to. And licensing and DRM has been a core part of game development. So what do we think the future of marketplaces look like? And for me, these are application-specific marketplaces, and they are permissionless, and they are going to be built on application, or rather domain-specific standards that cater towards the industry. We want to see healthy competition. And so I think we'll see both B2B and B2C. So next generation, Audible, Steam, or iTunes. But within the term B2C or B2B, this is really creator to consumer. The point of Web3 is to draw out the middleman. And you will have this spectrum of permissionless or permissioned, but we want to see healthy competition, we want to see efficient markets, and we want to see creators adequately rewarded. Thank you very much.